Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and Blizzard announced that we'll be able to grind essences, rank 3 essences, on our alts this Tuesday in a much easier system than what we currently have. No more honor farming for blood of the enemy, no more visiting Najjar for certain essences, and no more reputation grinds all over again just to play your alts. So finally, you might want to start to pick up and really start playing a bunch of different characters, maybe even in preparation for Shadowlands, in case one of those alts will be your new main. With this news on the front line, I decided to make a video on what are some of the best alt specs for you guys to start with, in case you want to play any of the brand new characters, which specs are doing really good, which ones feel the best to play since I play one of every character. If you guys are going to be leveling some alts, which specs should you probably start with in order to perform well in the game in the current meta, but also to explore some of the more enjoyable and better crafted playstyles. Small warning, I did not include any of the tank specs. I believe if you want to play a viable tank and do well at it, not only do you need to have knowledge of how to tank, mitigation, as well as defenses, but also the responsibility and gear requirement to be a viable tank to have a good experience to truly understand the spec is steep. So I am not going to be including tank specs because of the extra responsibility one would need in order to start truly playing one. This is why I'm going to mostly limit this video to DPS alternatives, especially with those specs that have triple DPS specs to choose from. I will try to choose the specs that are the most valuable or are maybe the most amount of damage for the ease of play. This video will include a couple of healers that I've been able to play before, probably some of the best ones in the meta that are easiest to pick up with, that have the most amount of healing without too much complexity in the healing playstyles. Not looking at any of these specs from a mythic world first perspective, but rather maybe like, starting perspective to maybe even heroic ready for any of you guys trying out a couple alts in this patch with this new update. We're gonna start the recommendations in no particular order, and I decided to start this one with hunters. If you're going to be getting a hunter up and running in patch 8.3, they're actually surprisingly good in patch 8.3. I mean, right before 8.3 raid came out, we heard a lot of top-end raiders saying that hunters might not be one of the classes that will be even brought to raids. They don't have any utility like a mage or a warlock or a shaman, and they might actually be quite poor inside of the PvE environment. And it turned out completely wrong. Beast Mastery Hunter still smashes it out of the park, and just for the sake of the fact that Beast Mastery is so good right now, I would have to recommend BM Hunter if you do want to get a hunter back up and running. Of course, you can try survival, you can give it a chance at marksman. They did recently get a small buff, so you might be able to have them actually playable. But Beast Mastery has been holding its own for quite a lot here in this patch. It's been very consistent, very powerful, really good in most PvE content, and quite okay in PvP as well. It's definitely the spec to start with because of its ease of play, the raw damage that it outputs, the mobility that it offers, and overall it is actually quite good, and it's scaled really nicely into this final patch of Battle for Azeroth. In patch 8.3, two of the more popular priest specs, Shadow as well as Discipline, both saw quite heavy nerfs for this patch. Priests have been very dominant as a healer as well as a DPS alternative within the PvE content, and have been quite good in PvP as well. For this patch, if you are making an alt, Shadow still is a decent choice. However, it is going to be very gear reliant, but still it's fairly easy to pick up and play, especially with the essences, since they are almost kind of account bound as of Tuesday. Getting the best essences will hopefully not be an issue, which is where one of those things where Shadow Priest can struggle. Gearing for Shadow Priest included with the essences, I kind of include essences as part of the gearing process because it's the outside sources besides being able to play the specs. With all those, which should be easier with Tuesday reset, Shadow Priest should be a lot easier to get up to speed. It's a very fun playstyle that very much isn't focused on GCD. It's actually one of those specs of casters that is basically ignoring the GCD changes of Battle for Azeroth. It's still tried and true and does quite good damage and brings valuable crowd control, even though it's more of a glass cannon squishing, very valuable control as well as damage within the PvP environment. However, if you do want to play a healer, Holy Priest is probably one of the best healers in general to start with. Very versatile, lots of useful talents, just overall good throughput healing. If you just need a caster to heal your allies without any gimmicks whatsoever, Holy Priest is probably still the best choice right now on the market. A lot of healers are good, and I would say for Priest, if you are beginning as a healer, this would be definitely one of those easier priests to really get into. They have a lot of mechanics some of the other classes have. a mix of direct cast, a mix of instant cast, a mix of AoE white healing, healing over time abilities. So basically playing a priest, you get a taste of what the other healers feel like as kind of mishmash of all the abilities and playstyles together, but overall it turns out to be a very solid healer to start with for anybody. When it comes to warriors, I feel like there's no better choice than Fury. The spec itself is still very GCD ignoring spec. It's very fast paced, it's very enjoyable to play. It has a really smooth playstyle of generating rage and spending rage. It's very easy to gear as well. Warriors have been very strong, and the reason why I would recommend first of all a DPS spec rather than the tank spec, because tanks have a lot of responsibility. I feel like a tank needs to know the mechanics, needs to have the gear before they can reliably do stuff. But for a DPS, you can get into a dungeon or a raid or PvP and just start slashing enemies left and right and do quite well with it. And I would also recommend Fury Warrior for anybody who is new and first time trying out themselves some warrior. I would recommend Fury over Arms. Even though Arms is a spec that I currently am choosing to play right now, and Arms warriors have gotten really good this patch, they are still very gear dependent. They're very tied to some Azeroth trades that make this current playstyle of Arms warrior very strong. It does scale super well towards the end of this patch in particular, so Arms warriors are proving themselves to be quite formidable. However, with Fury warriors, even if you don't have the very best in slot gear, you can still do quite a lot of damage, and quite reliable damage on top of that. Very enjoyable playstyle that doesn't really punish you too much for having totally completely awful gear. So if you're someone who always has bad energy on pieces, this is one of the reasons why I would recommend for a lot of you guys to at least start with the Fury Warrior. For Death Knights, both DPS specs of Unholy and Frost are very strong. I would personally recommend Frost, and this is more just a personal recommendation rather than anything that Frost brings. Both Death Knight specs are quite good. Both of them do need a little bit of gear before you really see them shine, and with essences being not really as much of an issue as of Tuesday, hopefully it'll be that much of an alleviation to some of the issues people have had, then both Frost and Unholy will be viable. However, there's a specific reason why I recommend Frost, is because you no longer have to play the Breath of Sindragosa playstyle. You know, the playstyle where you channel Frost Breath and you try to spam Obliterate, and it's kind of like a weird rotation where you front load a lot of your damage and then the rest of your rotation doesn't really matter that much. Well, the Ice Cap build with some of the changes with Azeroths as well as Essences for Frost is a viable alternative. It's a lot more enjoyable, there's a lot more abilities for you to press, and GCD wise it feels really good because they stack a lot of haste as well as that juicy critical strike. So I would say the new Frost Death Knight is something that I would recommend to a lot of players. Again, all specs are going to be very gear dependent, and this one you will need stats like every other before it really starts to shine, but that freedom of not having to play the Breath playstyle is just one of those best feelings ever. A lot of players describe the Breath playstyle kind of boring. It is effective, but yes, it is super boring. But the Ice Cap playstyle is just a brand new icing on the cake, and it feels very awesome to engage with. For mages, essentially you can play whatever spec you want. I feel like all specs are fairly good, although fire has been a bit more dominant in every piece of content, whether you want to do some dungeons, raiding, or PvP, which is why I would have to recommend fire if I had to choose out of all these three specs. And that's the plan that we're going to see here in this video. A lot of those specs that have 3 DPS alternatives, usually one spec is the easiest to play and probably has the best damage output, and that's why they are so easy for me to recommend to you guys. Fire has been a strong and a proven spec within PvE environment as well as PvP environment, and overall it has been the go-to spec for a lot of players. In gearing, I would say this spec is only a little bit more complicated than Arcane and Frost. All 3 mage specs love certain traits and are a little bit picky in terms of the gear that you end up getting for yourselves. Fire is a little bit picky, but the pickiness isn't quite heavy. It's not quite as hard to gear as some of the other classes on this video list, so Fire should be a decent option for a lot of you. Fire still has one of the coolest playstyles that draws people to it, the fast-paced, instant cast abilities that can be used in between abilities to light your hands full of fire and start chucking out a bunch of pyroblasts is a very satisfying experience, be it PvE, like Mythic Pluses and raids, big AoE single target, or PvP, just punishing enemies with massive crits back to back, and there's very little they can do about it. When it comes to rogues, while I love me some Outlaw, I would say the spec that is the easiest to play for the most amount of damage would have to be Assassination. Now, I'm not saying Assassination is an easy spec, it's more straightforward and it is easier to start with, if anything. Gearing is going to be huge for rogues, and if you want to do the most amount of damage, you need to have the best gear, best essences, just about best everything. But the results for a geared rogue really do show and are really noticeable. I would say Assassination is a great spec to start with. It is good in Mythic Pluses, it is good in raids, it's great in PvP, it's very straightforward as it is kind of a simple playstyle out of the other specs of rogue. Subtlety is a fun playstyle, but it's a lot of overlapping mechanics that get to be managed at the same time. And then Outlaw has the RNG, which a lot of people get turned off by, which is why I would say for the ease of gameplay and for the value of the damage that it outputs, Assassination is just kind of a given. The gearing process for the spec is slightly easier than the other specs. The essences is the only biggest thing for you to manage, and I think it's a great spec to at least start with if you ever want to branch out into subtlety, into Outlaw, whether you want to do keys, raiding, or PvP. But if you want to just play a no-nonsense playstyle that's very true to the rogue, stun lock, CC, big burst chains on targets, you will find that enjoyable playstyle with Assassination Rogue. I feel like Demon Hunters should be a really easy choice. You have HAVOC, which is your only DPS spec, and then you have Vengeance, which is a tank spec. For this video, I choose not to recommend tank specs unless this is the type of gameplay you want. When it comes to playing a tank, you usually take on far more of a role than others in terms of the amount of things that needed to be done. In terms of, I guess, the difficulty curve, you have a lot more responsibility, you have gearing process that needs to happen. Basically, if you are always dying as a tank and you're fairly new to the class, then it's going to be very difficult for you to find groups that will want for you to tank stuff for them. So this is why we're not going to include tanks. HAVOC Demon Hunter has been one of the strongest melee DPS in the game by far. I won't say that HAVOC Demon Hunters has been like the top DPS that's making some great plays and maybe even world first DPS, you know, any kind of huge parses or breaking records, but have definitely been in the top 5 no matter the situation. They won't be as insane in cleave as, let's say, an Outlaw Rogue or a Beastmaster Hunter, but they'll definitely be competitive. They won't be able to blast the enemy for full single target like a Fire Mage, but they will definitely be like second DPS or third DPS behind. Overall, I would say Demon Hunters have been very effective. They are always close to being like the top tier class. They usually never quite are, but that's exactly the reason why Blizzard never really had to nerf Demon Hunters. Included that with a fairly simple playstyle and very fast-paced gameplay because of all that haste that you bring inside of Metamorphosis. Demon Hunters create for a very enjoyable playstyle with massive amounts of mobility, great cooldowns, raid utility, a buff that everyone wants inside of dungeons and raids. Overall, there's very little reason to not pick HAVOC Demon Hunter as a spec to recommend. For monks, I have two options. You either go Windwalker if you want a DPS or MISTWEAVER if you want to heal. I would say for monks, Windwalker is an exceptionally enjoyable playstyle. The mastery, I've said it before and I'll say it again, super fun to play with. When you're playing with abilities and you try and make sure that those abilities never repeat, there's definitely something fun about the gameplay loop, and it keeps me engaged, and I enjoy my monks simply because of that. And if you want to heal as a monk, right now MISTWEAVERs are actually a solid choice as well. They're technically a melee healer, like they should be in melee with all the melee mechanics, trying to see if they can dodge melee mechanics and heal allies. However, you can play them as an old school version, ranged healer, just output a bunch of throughput healing into allies. So there's multiple playstyles for you to enjoy when you play a monk. Of course, if you want to expand past that, there's always Brewmaster, and even with the nerfs, Brewmaster is still a very tanky tank. They take a lot of damage, they absorb magic damage, physical damage, they have mobility, they have very interesting but simple to understand mitigation, they are very active in terms of the playstyle for it. So if you do end up going with a path of monk, you will have the tank spec to fall back on if that's the direction that you want to grow your character. There's a lot of opportunities, lots of potential when it comes to the raiding and PvP and PvE content, when it comes to playing a monk, and overall I would say they are a solid class of choice, with Windwalker being a very enjoyable, fast-paced, very mobile melee DPS, or a MISTWEAVER, which is a fairly easy to begin with, but very efficient in the healing output healer. Shamans have been one of those classes that's been exceptionally enjoyable once you get good gear on them, especially enhancement. Like, Enhance is one of those specs where the playstyle was very, very simple, but you don't really get to do that much damage until you get good gear. Once you have the right stat, right traits, you really get to shine as bright as possible. And no matter the playstyle, no matter if you are great with your rotation or sloppy, gear makes basically majority of the damage happen, more or less. But in this video, I would have to recommend Elemental. I feel like it's a great spec to start with. I guess Enhancement and Elemental are both very, very close, but if I had to choose which one does more damage with less gear, I would say Elemental definitely feels better to start with. It's a very fast-paced, rapid-fire range caster that has multiple schools of cast, which becomes very valuable in PvP. The amount of damage you can output with talents alone without having the best slot essences is also quite good in Elemental with all of your different elementals that you get to summon. There's a lot of bursts within the playstyle that naturally occurs. It plays well with crit for massive damage numbers, but if gearing is not nearly as important for you, then Enhancement Shaman is also another good spec that starts out a little bit rougher on the edges. You are basically a glass cannon, even though you are a melee. Most melee feel quite durable in the game, but Enhancement, you can output quite a lot of damage in a short notice. The playstyle is very simple and a lot of fun to execute. Half the time you're just spamming Storm Strike, but the damage you take from enemies, even just in the outside world, can be quite a lot if you're not prepared for it. But either way, I would choose either one of those specs. Restoration Shaman is a decent healer, although I feel like that one definitely takes a little bit extra time to fully master and understand. It's not quite as easy as some of the other healers for me currently to recommend. With Druids, I was originally going to recommend Balanced Druid, and I still think I'm going to stick with this one. Balanced Druid is the easiest one to start with. However, you can make an argument for any spec. Bear Druids, and while normally I don't recommend tanks, Bear Druids technically have the easiest rotation out of all the tanks in the game. I mean, between Swipes and Thrashes, that's really about it. And with a couple active mitigations that are off of GCD, there you go, you can start tanking. Restoration Druid is another great spec to start with. It has a lot of healing over time abilities, which are mostly instant cast, so you don't have to sit there and try to time your cast. Just load up an ally full of hots and then watch him just not die, as healing over time just keeps countering just about any damage that goes out. So they're also fairly easy to get into. Speaking about fairly easy, Feral Druids are also quite good. I mean, they feel a little bit weird at first to start with because of the energy regen, but besides casting Shred, maintaining Rip, which you don't really do since you can use Bites in order to extend Rips, maintaining Rake on the enemy, I mean, none of it really sounds all that hard. That spec just needs a little more gear, but it can be very efficient in AoE trash packs in Mythic Pluses, can be actually really good in raids for a variety of fights, and can be good in PvP. All the specs of Druid are not essentially bad, but if I had to really settle with one spec, I would have to do Balanced Druid. Boomkins do good damage. They have been very strong this patch. They play really well with gear. Of course, everybody wants the best in slot traits, but even if you don't have the best in slot traits, Balanced Druids generally tend to perform fairly well either way. But for Druids, the biggest part that comes into the playstyle and how good the spec is, it depends how much effort are you personally willing to invest into a Druid. Whether you're playing Boomkin, whether you're playing a tree for restoration, whether you want to play Bear in dungeons and raids, whether you want to play Feral in PvP, whichever spec and whichever piece of content you want to engage with, it all depends just how much effort and time you put into it. That's really what it comes down to. Balanced Druids take the list though, just because they are very much valued in Mythic Plus dungeons. They do quite good damage in raids. They can have a lot of fun in BGs and maybe even in rated BGs. Technically, all the specs have a specialization, what they're really exceptionally good at, but I would say the one spec that has probably the most amount of specializations that it thrives in, I would say Balanced Druid is probably the closest one with the most amount of uses. When it comes to Paladins, there are two choices for you. If you want a DPS, Retribution Paladin is a solid spec. Some people describe it as a very simple spec, but simple doesn't always have to be bad. Retribution Paladin have a little bit easier time gearing because they use a variety of different stats for different builds. So while one Paladin might prioritize haste versatility, another Paladin could have a build that's all about mastery and crit. It really all depends how you end up building your character, what pieces of gear you have, and because it's so modular, it can kind of adjust on the fly, so that's one of the advantages. It does quite a lot of damage in PvP, it can do a lot of damage in AoE Mythic Pluses, and it can definitely slam and hold its own inside of raids. It's a viable solution if you have a Paladin and you need a DPS slot filled. A Paladin can go DPS and be quite effective. where paladins have been exceptionally strong in as healers. Their performance in patch 8.3 and in previous patch has been quite awesome. They even got a small nerf in patch 8.3, but it hasn't been holding holy paladins back at all. It's a healer that can do PvP healing, raid healing, dungeon healing, and overall can put out quite a bit of damage on its own as well if you are, or your guild or your group is lacking a little bit of damage here and there without losing any healing viability, which is quite nice. You have a variety of defensive and helpful abilities you can provide for your party or raid, which makes them exceptionally strong. With so many abilities that can be used to protect yourself or protect allies, I feel like it's a healer that can comfortably make mistakes and even has very much emergency buttons to save allies out of a pinch. So as you learn your Retribution Paladin or your Holy Paladin, this is one of those specs where I feel like you have plenty of safety net to really explore on the spec and mess around with different abilities, different builds until you truly figure it out. I would even say it's one of the better healers to start with where you want to be effective but you're fairly new at the game. When it comes to Warlocks, I would say, again, it's one of the situations where you're looking at a spec with 3 DPS alternatives: Affliction, Destruction, and Demonology. Technically, you can make all the specs work if you have the best in slot gear, but the one spec that has been the most effective in just about every part of content has been Destruction. Chaos Bolts has been the method that Destruction has been using in order to stay relevant and powerful and on top of the DPS charts. Just checking out Chaos Bolts, whether you're inside of a dungeon, PvP arena, or a raiding environment, is usually enough to maintain good DPS. Maybe top 3, maybe top 5, but it still allows you to put out quite a bit of damage. Destruction Warlocks also are flexible because they can go for single target damage, they can go for cleave damage, massive AoE every time you drop down an Infernal and just make it rain fire. They can attack enemies close to each other or far apart. They can really brute force a bunch of damage in a short moment into a single person or really singe an entire party over a bit of time. I would even say gearing for Destruction Warlocks has been a little bit easier than the other specs. For example, Demonology and Affliction need specific traits and even stacks of certain traits no matter the fight. For Destruction, you have 2 options. You can either go for a variety of traits which makes you good in just about any situation, and that's probably the best way to go for pure single target. Just get yourself a variety of different traits that give you different buffs and different bonuses, since none of them are super effective stacking, but having one of each is generally better for the playstyle and the feel. Or you can even specialize in certain fights. Let's say a fight is a 2-target cleave, or maybe a fight where adds come out from time to time intermittently. You can go for traits that allow you massive amounts of haste every time you attack an enemy that's almost at full health. And with an ad heavy hectic fight, massive amounts of haste all the time. Maybe your fight is all about cleaving 2 adds and trying to burst them down. You can increase the output of damage you do every time you cleave. There's so many different ways to specialize your Destruction Warlock for different situations, but there's almost no wrong answer no matter how you slice it. Destruction Warlock just has been really good, very consistent, and sometimes it's not the top DPS for every situation, but in majority, as an overall, that's a spec that I would recommend for a majority of players. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts about the specs on this list, and if you guys would change any of the specs. I was just trying to give you guys the specs that are doing the best, but also recommend you specs that would be more enjoyable to play in general, depending on which character and which playstyles are doing good right now in this current meta. Not only from the raiding environment, but also including dungeons and even including the PvP content as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see all of you in another one.